Welcome to Canterbury Trails, a weekly walk through the faith and culture of our Anglo heritage.
O Lord, our Heavenly Father,
England is first and foremost for us a home.
That which we are.
Forth now, fear no darkness.
One equal temper of heroic hearts.
grant that all our doings may be ordered by thy governance.
It's the man who's only thinking about doing a good job or telling the truth who becomes really original.
Made weak by time and fate, but strong in will.
And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, for the joy of battle was on them.
To strive, to seek, to find.
Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
And not to yield.
You have got to be happy in those quiet moments when you remember that you are alive.
Amen.
Welcome to another episode of Canterbury Trails. My name is CJ Engel, and I have two guests, one guest and my co-host, of course, Jared Lovell. We're discussing an article entitled Old High Church Planting. It was written for the North American Anglican, so I'll have Jared go ahead and introduce the theme and the guest.
Well, that doesn't spell well for my future as a co-host in this. I've been reduced to guest. So our guest today is Joseph Colleti, and he has written a really interesting article about old high church revival, old high church church planting, what that looks like, that I thought was worthy of some discussion today on the podcast. Joe is living in State College, Pennsylvania, and so Joe, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where'd you go to school? Who are you associated with? What's your religious connection to Anglicanism? How did you get into Anglicanism? Feel free to expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I was originally born outside the church. My father was raised Roman Catholic, but was an atheist by the time that I was born. My mother was, she was raised in Orthodox Judaism, but by the time that I was born, she was in conservative Judaism. And I eventually, through the long, complicated story of my life, left Judaism, became an atheist, kind of came back to religion, but wasn't exactly sure where I was putting my footing. Tried out various forms of Judaism, but eventually the Lord brought me to his church. And eventually I was baptized as an Anglican through my own little theological discovery, became Christian, started looking at the differences between the different denominations and landed on Anglicanism and was baptized in the ACNA. I eventually started a YouTube channel, which is how I kind of started getting a little bit of an audience called Young Anglican, where I talked about, basically the theological issues that brought me to Anglicanism in the first place. But originally, my area of focus, my field of study in college was American history, and specifically the period right up to and during the Constitutional Convention. Mm-hmm. So, kind of the factors that led to the American Revolution and the theory of American government and those kinds of questions. So, one of the things I enjoy reading about and studying in general is just that period of American history, which I ended up writing this article about, which I guess kind of brings two of my interests together in a nice, neat way about American history, but then also Anglicanism in North America and the history of kind of high church Anglicanism specifically in the United States.
I like your opening question of your article, Joe, and I think it's a great place to frame the whole conversation. As you two both know, we're sort of in a rediscovery phase of American, religious life, where people are rediscovering these old paths. And so we sort of have to address some of the same questions that you might address here. So let me just open with this initial framing question for your article, and you can discuss why you framed it that way, and we can go from there. So your question is theological rigorism, insistence on conformity to the prayer book and other traditionally high church distinctives, is that theological rigorism conducive to mission and evangelicalism? So why is that your opening question, and what are you trying to accomplish with this framing?
Yeah, something that I've encountered, is a bit of a dichotomy in Anglicanism that's assumed, and especially is prominent, I would say, in the ACNA, which is that the distinctives of Anglicanism So things like our articles or the prayer book or the rubrics, those things are barriers to mission. And we kind of have to play this game of, okay, how missional are we going to be on one end, and then being confessional, in some sense, you might say, is over here. And we kind of have to pick a middle spot between those two things, and you're playing this game. And I think that's an assumption that doesn't have as much support fundamentally if we take a kind of a bigger historical view. A lot of this comes, in my opinion, from people prioritizing immediate, quick growth, or at least, kind of butts and seats versions of what means to be a big growing church, versus thinking about what sets up the institution's legacy, what is actually good for the church in the long run. And that was what I kind of wanted to highlight in this article, was how I think consistency with our formularies and being high church, which was, I think, it's an interesting term because it's kind of evolved over time, and part of that is due to the differences, that things that have changed in what we might call the Anglican communion. But being high church used to mean refusing to compromise with various subjects of potential compromise. So the term latitudinarian and low church used to be the same, but today when we use the word low church, we kind of mean something a little different than that, in my opinion.
Let's camp out there a little bit, because some of our listeners, you threw out a couple of terms there: high church, latitudinarian, low church. So what do we mean by, and I think this is really worth spending some time on to clarify our terms. What do we mean when we talk about old high church? How is that, or how does it relate to, or is it distinct from, say, Oxford movement or Anglo-Catholicism? And, is all high church the same? You've kind of already implied that it's not, and that the definition has shifted. So if you want to dig into the history a little bit, even relating it back to England in terms of the English Civil War, Laud, Archbishop Laud, and that movement, Lancelot Andrews, those figures, can you help our listeners understand a little bit what we're talking about when we say old high church? What all does that entail in terms of beliefs or preferences, or even stylistic differences from, say, a low church Puritanism or a low church latitudinarianism?
Yeah. So I think, as with most of the time the prefix old is used, it wasn't originally a part of it. There's a distinction that maybe we would want to be able to make between what, say, I think Archbishop Laud is a great example, what he meant by high church, versus today when you hear that term, I think in most Anglicans' minds, it's associated with lots of things that actually most people would be surprised to find out are very recent additions to Anglicanism. Part of that comes from ritualism, but then also some things that we associate with being quote unquote high church come from, kind of 20th century liturgical kind of ecumenism effort that was going on between mainline Protestants, we might say, but also Roman Catholicism, where there is this kind of, if Vatican II can kind of bring Rome here, and we can kind of go here, and we get, that'll be bring us closer to kind of positive agreement. But originally, the distinction was, so I think the Civil War is a good place to start. There was a settlement, the Elizabethan settlement, that was agreed to, and that came with not only the 39 Articles, but a set of canons and rubrics that were being enforced. The kind of first spat, as far as I understand it, would be the kind of Hooper controversy with vestments, and there's a priest basically who doesn't want to wear vestments because he thinks it's unbiblical. And the Anglican stance was, well, sorry, you have to do all these things in good order. The church mandates that you wear these vestments. It's not really up to you as an individual minister to make that decision. And all of the kind of conflicts that would break apart English Christianity kind of come on this question of, okay, does the church have the authority to mandate regulations of vestments, of theology, all these kinds of questions, over and against the kind of individual protest that from somebody who might object to these kinds of requirements. Another big one that's going to come up more so, it comes up in Scotland when Laud and some of those guys try to enforce a kind of settlement between the Presbyterianism that's in Scotland. Things like kneeling for communion. What does that convey? Does the church have the right to require you to kneel for communion? And there were many people within the Church of England who thought, is it really worth kind of enforcing these rules? Because we're creating divisions with people who don't want to follow them, in their opinion, needlessly. And then there was another group, typified, I would say, by Laud, which eventually become to call Arminians, but that's in my opinion, partially a misnomer. Yeah. Which basically says, yes, we do have the right to do this, and it's good to have these, these rules, and we have to enforce them. And Laud enforced those kinds of rules at harsh penalties, infamously, basically taking people up on charges for not doing things like kneeling for communion, which was really controversial even at the time. This eventually causes the English Civil War between what you might say is this high church faction, and then dissenters on one end, and then groups of people who were sympathetic to the dissenters, but who had remained within the Church of England nonetheless. On both ends of this spectrum, you could say the high church faction would be the ones who wanted to enforce it, and then low church, in that context, meant people who, for the sake of unity of the church, did not want to enforce those rules as rigorously. Mm-hmm. I think that those terms end up developing because then I think there's kind of a casual association. Low church means today to a modern evangelical means stuff like praise bands or worship music, all those kinds of things. But what they would have been compromising with would have been 16th, 17th century Puritans who would have had a very strong sense of the regulative principle of worship. So even those compromises wouldn't have taken us, it's kind of a triangular spectrum if you can think of it. There's like high church here, Puritans here, and now we've introduced what we would call like contemporary worship, which, it's hard to have these conversations too sometimes because even the high churchmen and the low churchmen originally were saying God cares about how we worship him. We have to take a lot of care and thought about how we do this. And they're arguing about that with the exception that God cares about how we worship him. Right. So there's kind of a modern attitude that, whatever just attracts the most people is obviously the best way to worship God.
So if we could summarize a couple of points, I would say, is it, and feel free to edit, what I'm saying, correct if I'm going off on the wrong way here. But so if we were going to talk about low church versus high church, low church, when it comes to theology, we're talking about a hard Calvinism among the Puritans, all 5 points or none kind of thing. You're talking about regulative principle of worship, probably, very bare churches without ornamentation. You mentioned not kneeling for communion, nothing extra, not necessarily even prayer books. Everything should be spontaneous. Celebrations of holidays, Christmas and Easter, would be out for the low churchmen. So to give our listeners an idea, that's what we're talking about here on the low church side. In a lot of your theological Puritans, your John Owens, your William Perkins, your Richard Sibbes, those kinds of figures would fit more or less into that category. Your high church would include probably just the opposite from a lot of what we just said. So, except as you, I think, rightfully noted, in terms of Arminian, the Calvinist types, from my understanding, would refer to them negatively as Arminians. That's not really a good label for them. I think probably a better label would be a moderate Calvinism, that is okay with a little uncertainty on these questions. I don't think they quite fit, your uber free will Arminian, but nonetheless, that's what they were called. So something, a more moderate course on the Calvinistic question. They're okay with ornamentation in the churches, more formal liturgy, use of the Book of Common Prayer, more ritual, and celebration of holidays like Christmas, Easter, etc. So is that a fair summary, or is there a couple more bullet points we could add to those distinctions?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And I think one of the core questions is, what is the authority of the visible church? Because can the church say you should celebrate Christmas and Easter?
Joe, does royal supremacy play any role in this distinction?
Yes, also. So another question that was live at the time that was kind of mapped onto these as well was, originally James I starts this trend of kind of a strong monarchy that's, one of his goals is to kind of unite Scotland and England in a common religious consensus, and he sees his own royal authority as kind of the tool to make that happen. He's a little bit more willing to compromise than his son, Charles I is, on a lot of these questions. But Charles I agrees that the royal authority is the solution to disunity in a lot of these ways, but is more willing to penalize those who do not conform in a lot of ways than his father was. And there's an invasion of Scotland and all these kinds of interesting historical details that come out of this. But the high churchmen were more likely, again, because this is kind of about authority and conformity, we're more likely to say, if the king says to do something, that's good, because they were more likely to hold to a very strong version of divine right monarchy, that God instituted the institution of kings for our betterment, and we have an obligation to obey them. The high church originally, you can also read, George Carlton is a very good example of this. This is over and against the papistical view. So they would have objected to Roman Catholics who had a loyalty to the Pope above their loyalty to kings. And this was a big controversy. And again, this would have been a distinction that the high churchmen would have wanted to say, you can't have those external authority obligations to the Pope. For instance, one of the big controversies, we've all maybe heard of Guy Fawkes Day, but that was a plot that was largely inspired by the king, or by the Pope, I should say, saying that the monarch of England is illegitimate and you should displace them. This happened during Elizabeth's reign. She was very concerned about being assassinated, but the gunpowder plot occurs during James I's reign, and there's a bunch of reforms that happen when they try to explode Parliament, and the justification was, well, the Pope is the head of the church, my loyalty is to God above my king, so if the Pope tells me that I can blow up Parliament, then I can. And so the high churchmen wanted to stamp down on this and say, no, like Romans 14, you have to obey the civil authorities, even if you disagree with them. That's not how this works.
So what about maybe American listeners to this podcast who hear, old high churchmen associated with divine right monarchy, and therefore that's the bad guys. I already know that, so I'm not on that side. And why should they continue to listen on here as you commend an old high church approach to evangelism and church planting?
Yeah, this was a question that was really live for Americans during the Revolution and after the Revolution, especially Anglicans. As I mentioned in the article, lots of Anglicans were loyalists. There was some places where this was very true. I think this was in New England, New Jersey, and New York. That was very much the case. Less so in other colonies. So Virginia, most of the Anglican clergy were patriots, partially because the state was very involved in the church and the state had rebelled against the crown. But there was an association with loyalism, partially because in order to be clergy, you had to swear an oath and mean it to obey the king. And all the Anglican clergy in all the colonies had sworn that oath. And so many of them felt they had a duty, just like those old high churchmen that we were talking about before, to the monarch. And then after, of course, the Revolution wins, it's like, well, what do we do now? It was this big open question, and a lot of people didn't have really solid answers for it. The consensus around this question kind of came slowly. What I would say today, to say the modern American, the way that I would translate this is that this was an instinct amongst Anglican theologians. Again, the term Anglican wasn't even being used yet, but that's a whole other conversation. To say my vows and oaths mean something. If I vow that I'm going to do something, I'm going to obey this civil authority, I'm going to do that. And, I think that relates to the traditional position that Anglicans have strong stance on divorce and remarriage, as well as saying you promised this, you can't just break it because you don't want to do it anymore. Mm-hmm. And that relates to the kind of broader kind of Anglo-Saxon civilization principle of the iron rule of law. There's a tendency to think for ourselves that when we come in conflict with a rule or a law, that yes, it's usually a good rule, but I'm the exception because they don't understand my circumstances. Mm-hmm. What the high churchman wants to say is, you think that because you're biased, and you need to be able to remove yourself from the situation and have just a general respect for the law, and try not to see yourself as the exception, and that temperamentally that would be good for you. And so an American can say that just as well. And so you can, after the American Revolution, I think John Henry Hobart is an American Episcopalian bishop who I think treats this issue very well. And he basically says, look, we accept that the law of the land now is Congress and the Senate and the House of Representatives and the President, and that's fine. That is the law now. And we have an obligation to do that. And being a high church Anglican actually doesn't have to do necessarily with the specific form of government you find yourself under, but simply with a respect for rightly ordained authorities. And different Anglicans parse that out differently than he did, but I think that's a fair reading of the stance, and he would have definitely considered himself a high churchman.
So when you talk about church planting, how does that fit into the equation? I mean, there's the historical angle, so let's start there. But I do want to finish this conversation sort of talking about the present age and, what can be said about, our own unique situation. But historically, how do you relate the old high church tradition to, the concept of planting a new one?
Yeah. So this is, it's interesting to see the transition as the new world gets opened up in Christian history. Mm-hmm. So, for most of the English Reformation happens, we get our formularies, and that is applied in England, which already has churches. Everyone would say they're Christians. Most people would say that they're a part of whatever the established church of their country is. Then, and you can see this conflict happening as well, or this kind of shift of how do we do this question being asked as well in other colonial countries at the time, France, Spain, the Netherlands. When we come to the New World, how we have to really think of ourselves as missionaries again in a way that we haven't since maybe the Middle Ages with Scandinavia and the Baltic and all these other kinds of regions. There's another huge swath of the world that has to be evangelized. And so you can get at the very beginning of American colonization, there is the Puritans who are in charge of the North for the large part, and then the Anglican Church or the Church of England has dominion over the kind of southern colonies, and then you get Pennsylvania, which is its own case. But this leads to the creation of what's called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which is an Anglican missions organization. And one of the key questions that's involved in the American mission field, again, this is the 1600s, 1700s, and Thomas Bray, who's one of these, a great resource for somebody who wants to know what was Christianity like in the late 1600s, early 1700s. He writes a lot about it. He was very influential in the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The question is, to what extent do we do the rigorous rubrics, canons, all those kinds of things that apply in England? To what extent do we apply them in the New World? Especially when the northern colonies are Puritan by establishment. Like, they do not follow the 39 Articles. They do not follow the prayer book. You can find Puritans who in like Harvard and Yale textbooks from this period, which talk about the prayer book as if it's like a satanic tool, okay? And they've never seen it, because think about this. There's a whole generation of Puritans who've grown up in Harvard or in Boston and in Massachusetts, Connecticut, who didn't actually flee England. They don't even know what they're opposed to as much anymore. But there's a very strong antipathy to the Church of England because of the kind of internal mythology of the Puritan outlook. So the history of Anglicanism in those colonies doesn't really begin until Parliament passes a protection in the late 1600s for Church of England members in all the colonies. Because the assumption by everybody at this time was if a faithful Church of England man walked into Connecticut, Massachusetts with a prayer book, like everyone would freak out and lose their minds. And it wasn't even like, in Pennsylvania, even though it's run by Quakers, they had a kind of religious tolerance and religious freedom. They did not have that attitude in the North. And so it's not until, and then about 30 years after this rule of Parliament, which the governments in Connecticut and Massachusetts were upset about, that they had to tolerate Church of England members. And you can read them going back and forth on this policy, that it even becomes possible for there to really be Church of England parishes in the northern part of the 13 colonies. Then in the 1720s, a bunch of students at Yale start getting really into ecclesiology and the theology of ordination and asking questions like this. There's debate societies. You can read, by the way, Yale still has them. There was like every year a topic of debate that they would go through as students at Yale. And this year was ordination. And almost all the people at Yale at that time would have been ministers or seminarians preparing for ministry. And a group of Yale students and faculty and even the dean of Yale started to be convinced of the necessity of Episcopal ordination. And all eventually gave a speech to the Yale student body saying, yeah, we are going to leave Connecticut and go to England to be episcopally ordained. And they got, everyone freaked out about this, just as you can imagine. It was called the Yale apostasy, thereafter, because the thought was, if you're becoming a member of the Church of England, you're barely Christian anymore. They go to England to get ordained, come back, because there's no bishops in the New World. And now they have to plant churches because there are no Church of England parishes in New England. It was barely even legal until 30 years ago. So they start a tradition that I tried to track out in my article of church planting in the, in hostile territory where there are other Christians and there's Native Americans. I didn't talk as much about mission to the Native Americans, but that was a big part of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel as well. But basically, these New England, by conviction Anglicans, rather than just kind of being casually born into it and thinking of themselves as my parents were Church of England, whatever. They were very convinced of the distinctives. They love the prayer book. They're trying to introduce the prayer book and do that in a missional context where they don't have large cathedrals. How do we plant churches, and how do we explain to other people why it even matters that there is a Church of England or that bishops matter? And so you get this huge pamphleteering culture, which is also really interesting to dissect. One of the leaders of this movement is a doctor named Dr. Samuel Johnson, not doctor as in a medical doctor, but as in he has a PhD. And he becomes ordained as an Anglican priest, and he is really involved in going to a town and saying, we're going to build a Church of England church in this town, and this is what that means, and here is what our distinctives are, and all these other kind of things. And he's doing this in a very similar way to maybe some Anglican church planters today, in a context where most people don't know what that means. They haven't lived in England. They are used to congregationalism. They think that the only differences in Christianity are Old Light Congregationalists and New Light Congregationalists, which was an internal split at the time in the Congregationalist church. And they're being told, okay, actually there are all these other questions of ecclesiology and these kinds of things that you have to wrestle with. And they were being given prayer books. Samuel Johnson, they had a very small budget from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And a huge portion of that budget didn't go to paying ministers. They just did this off of basically actually made very poor wages, and I document that in the article, but they spent it on buying prayer books to distribute to people, to say, here's what the prayer book is and says. And it's not this horrible, papistical document. It's actually full of beautiful prayers that are very biblical, and explaining that to people. And they didn't do what lots of other missionaries at this time ended up doing, or church planters, we might say, in the colonies ended up doing, which was trying to downplay the distinctives between the Church of England and Congregationalism, but instead they upplayed them, and they said, these are actually really important distinctives, and here's why we believe them, and we'll argue about them with you, and that worked. And so I show basically that, what was basically illegal denomination in New England until 30 years ago explodes in New England. It becomes one of the more prominent churches in New England. And Congregationalist ministers and politicians are freaking out about this. People have said, John Adams, who is from Boston, said this is one of the leading reasons for the American Revolution. In his opinion, was people in New England who were afraid about the growing influence of the Church of England. Mm-hmm. And then there were calls for a bishop, and that was his own interesting political issue to dissect. But what I think should surprise people was how successful they were in church planting, Anglican churches throughout New England and New York and New Jersey, and they were successful. And what they didn't do was downplay the distinctives, but instead said these are really, really important, and were infamously high church. These are the guys who first start arguing that we need a New World bishop, for instance. Most of the Church of England ministers in places like Virginia and Maryland and South Carolina, South Carolina less so, that's an interesting case, the southern states, which had Anglicanism as the established religion of those colonies, they didn't really care that much about getting a bishop in the New World. And in fact, they thought it would kind of cramp their style. Mm-hmm. It was these high church, New England Anglicans, converts, who said, wait a minute, our ecclesiology demands that we have a bishop in the New World. Like, we can't just let this kind of not be a priority. Like, this has to be the number one thing. So Samuel Johnson wrote tons and tons of articles about, and pamphlets at the time, about why there should be a New World bishop. And he was less compromising than even some other high churchmen. Thomas Chandler. Thomas Chandler creates what's called the Chandler Plan, which would be a kind of inoffensive episcopate in the New World, right? Because in the Old World, in England, bishops have legal prerogatives. They govern divorces. They own huge estates, all this kind of stuff. So Chandler says, well, we'll just kind of have a bishop who's like any other priest, but he ordains, and that's it. And you don't have to be worried about this. But most of the non-Anglicans in some of these states where this was being proposed were terrified of the idea of getting a New World bishop, because they thought it would be like step one to the hostile takeover by the Church of England of the entire colony. John Adams has an interesting letter where he wrote to a friend at the time saying that if Parliament can tax us for all these things, then they can create an episcopate in the New World, and think about the horror of that, and there being New World bishops and all this kind of stuff. Mm. All that to say that these guys cared about the claims that Anglicans make, like we need bishops and we need prayer books and the liturgy is important and rubrics and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, so I'm doing some work in this area as well for a talk I'm going to give next month on Anglicans in the American Revolution, their role. And so that topic is going to have to address both the Loyalist side as well as the Anglicans, who were pro-revolution. And you're exactly right in terms of it tended to be the case where Anglicans were in the majority. They tended to be more on the patriot side, and where they were in the minority, they tended to be more loyalist. And something else that's really fascinating that I noticed is in terms of the rapid growth that was experienced in these New England churches, these Anglican New England churches, is it had an appeal to people as well, because when they went into a lot of these Puritan or Presbyterian churches, the sermons were often like these political screeds. So the sermons tended to be overly political, and they would find a way to take whatever passage they were reading and make it about the colonial situation and their relationship with the mother country. Whereas in these New England Anglican churches, they were much less political. And I think it relates to what you were saying, like, yeah, the king is there. That's the established authority. We don't have to relitigate, our relationship all the time with the mother country. We're here to hear the word and sacraments. And for some, the less politically inclined, I know we hear this a lot of times, among, conservative Presbyterian Puritan types today, saying, the church needs to preach politics again, and not be so neutral and soft. And in a way, I think that is true. I think they're responding to, some of the Reform to Kingdom modern accommodations of the past century. But there is a danger there too. There was a time when the church was preaching politics. It was turning a lot of people off, because it was like, is there anything in the Bible that's just theological, that's not, finding symbols, of, what the king or parliament abuses. So, I thought that struck me, that thought struck me as well, as you were talking about the appeal of these church planners in New England. Not only are they emphasizing the differences, but they are staying really on task. You might think, well, I think a lot of Americans might think, if you're just going along with the government, and upholding monarchy, upholding establishment, ritualism, liturgy, then you don't really mean it. We have it so in our psyche that to mean it, it's spontaneous. To mean it, it's not intentional. To mean it, it's not formal. So we read the Puritans, and it's very affective. It's very emotional, very spiritual. And we say we like the Puritans because the emotions come through. It's very affective. We like John Edwards talking about affections, in worship and all of that, proper affections. So that means they're over against the people that are formal and don't mean it. And yet these people who are supposedly formal and don't mean it tend to be less political, actually really excited about what they believe, and are willing to share it. And I think that's jarring to some people. How can you be formal and be evangelical in your approach? And so, it is fascinating that actually does work.
Yeah. It's interesting. Frederick Mills, who wrote about this period of the Church of England and New England, he has a book called Bishops by Ballot. It's a really interesting treatment. But his explanation for why the Anglican Church was so appealing was that, like you said, the Congregationalist Church had become very political because the political factions that people voted for were literally typed onto religious factions. So there was the New Light and the Old Light faction, and you would vote based off of what your religious position was on that issue. And the New Light, Old Light debate was very much like what you're talking about with this kind of emotionalism versus scholarship and all these kinds of things. One of the big questions was, does a minister have to go to seminary, or can he just have an amazing ministry out in the backwoods and that vindicates his leadership? All those kinds of questions. And the new growing Church of England kind of posed itself as having just pretty strict, convincing standards that we have always held to, and we're not going to change based off of what is, popular today, and all these, difficult questions. One of the interesting tensions they had to deal with was the Church of England was growing so fast in New England that they didn't have enough priests. There were just lay readers who were reading at these churches, the liturgy and everything. But in a way, the Book of Common Prayer was perfectly suited for that situation, because if it was a lay minister in any other denomination, he'd have to figure out what he's doing, but instead with the prayer book, it's like, well, here you go. Here's how you do this church service. You don't have to think it up on your own. It's a perfect tool actually for that kind of kind of expanding church in a lot of ways. And I think we kind of miss that today.
Mm-hmm. I have a tricky question for you. Like, so what compels people who grew up in a low church environment or perhaps had no exposure to high church culture? What, like in this early this late 18th century context, what attracted people to that? And maybe it's similar to what attracts people today. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's some overlap. You can read some of these guys explaining why they changed. So James Wetmore, who's one of the Yale apostates, as they're called, his explanation was purely, it's like ministry, and he doesn't see... one of his things is basically there were Congregationalists who would positionally argue for presbyteral succession. But he argues, but you don't have any record of that either. So you're saying that in theory this exists, but then I can point to all these different times when you guys didn't even require the laying on of hands for ordination. So like it's a Mott and Bailey argument. It's purely hypothetical. So he would have conceded that presbyteral succession might even be possible, but it's not even worth arguing about because you guys don't require that. So for him, it was a church order thing. You guys don't really have, here are your standards. Here's what you believe. Here's how this is practiced. And he makes a similar argument actually to the one John Keble makes in the Tractarians about, well, if you had a government and somebody said, I come from the government of Christ, you'd probably say, okay, well, what links you to Christ? And it would be this kind of it would be like saying, okay, well, he appointed apostles and this general sense, authority comes down from them to us, originally from Christ. And that's a fairly standard argument, was in his opinion, really all that it takes. There were lots of people, I talked about Philander Chase in the article as well. He says it's just a prayer book. He thought it was so beautiful, and he thought, why are we not using this tool for all Christianity? It perfectly summarizes the gospel. It summarizes our state and need for God very well. It just really, there's no need to innovate on it. And he kind of, in some of his more, he wouldn't have, he was too pastoral to say this to congregants, but he said some of his letters basically like, he thought the reason for that Protestants in America and in England weren't in the Church of England was mostly pride, that they wanted to do it on their own way and in their own terms. And he didn't think that was, sensible at all. And thought basically there really weren't any good arguments against what should be the default version of Protestantism, which were the magisterial Protestant traditions that you can find and for Americans, that would be Anglicanism. And this was a much more popular argument then than it is today. But basically, like, okay, well, if you say you don't want to be a schismatic, which we all shouldn't want to be, the default then for an Anglo-Saxon country like ours, which comes from England, should be Anglicanism. Mm-hmm. That was really popular at the time. I think today that has less purchase, partially because people aren't as, hurt by the accusation of, you started your own denomination as they would have been in the 1700s. Today we have people who proudly say, I am non-denominational. My church, we just started our own thing. That's the selling point, But at the 1700s, even most Protestants would have been ashamed to say, I'm the founder of some sect or new church or whatever. Even in the Great Awakening, most Methodists, they didn't want, actually, this is another interesting conversation. So Methodist church today is different, right? But at the time, it would have been a part of the Church of England. And Francis Coke and Asbury tried to be united to the nascent Episcopal Church, but Samuel Seabury, who is from this New England, more rigorous version of Anglicanism, basically said, "You guys don't check out. You don't believe. You cut articles out of the 39 Articles. You don't subscribe to the Athanasian Creed. You don't want to use our prayer book consistently, and you don't even really require ministers to go to seminary, and even other bishops." So Bishop William White, who was the bishop in Philadelphia, criticized Seabury for being like a snob. But Seabury, this is another point that I kind of want to be able to connect for people. Seabury planted like 50 churches in his lifetime. He had an evangelical heart. He did want to see the church grow, and he cared. But he didn't want to compromise to do that.
Right. Yeah, Seabury's one of my heroes, and he gets talked down at a little bit for his bringing in the use of the Scottish prayer book, and because if you know your American Revolution, he famously debated Alexander Hamilton at Queen's College, and so he's your your paradigmatic English snobbish loyalist type. But I mean, if you dig into that guy's life, as you just said, this is not some ivory tower curmudgeonly theologian that's just saying the old way is better. I mean, this guy was really active, really had a heart for ministry, to the point that he was against the revolution the entire time. And I think this is what's so fascinating, is that yet he felt so strongly about how we needed a bishop here in the New World that he goes back to England, trying to get consecrated as a bishop, and England is dragging their feet. And so he says, okay, I don't have time for this, goes over to Scotland to be consecrated as a bishop, and then comes back to the New World, back to the colonies, and then continues to preach, teach, and plant churches. And I don't know about you, but like, if I'm Seabury and I've been, castigated by all these dirty colonials, these unwashed masses of colonials who look down at you and have called you names and all this stuff, I don't know how strong my heart for ministry would be to continue planting churches after my side lost the war and my fellow loyalists are packing up going to Canada because they lost their homes. I mean, it really takes a heart for ministry to minister in that environment, and that was characterized Seabury's life. So yeah, absolutely, this guy is a real hero in terms of his heart for communicating the Anglican tradition to an Anglo-Saxon people. And so here we've been talking, we got probably getting close to the end, but we've been talking a lot about history. I'll give you an opportunity to step in it in a way. So how does this apply today when especially we see in the ACNA, it seems there seems to be a push to add a little water to everything, to make us, a slightly hipper version of what is out there. And by slightly hipper, meaning, we incorporate a little bit of everything. We have some robes. Here's a few candles for you, some robe, but, we're trying, it seems, ever more to be, non-denominational with, a little cool history and mysticism mixed in. Where I think a specific example of this recently, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't go into all the details, I don't mean to slander anybody, but it seems, even just recently with the new ACNA Archbishop Wood talking about Bible reading plans for the new year. And I saw a number of people saying, hey, have you ever heard of the lectionary? It's called it's before the new Bible reading plans. There is this thing called a lectionary we've had for a long time. Why not promote the lectionary instead of this, innovative reading plan? So, and I just see these things that come out with the, Anglican, ACNA press, with, these little tools or whatever. It's like we've been developing these tools, they're not new. Why not go back to that? Why do we have to keep trying to innovate, thinking we're going to broaden our appeal? So here's an opportunity, as I said, to step in it, so to speak. It's one thing to criticize, or commend people who lived 200 years ago. And I'm not looking for, any kind of direct criticism. I respect our bishops. I respect Bishop Wood. I respect my own bishop, Bishop Sutton, Bishop Jenkins, all my bishops. So I'm not, trying to, bring them down. I'm just trying to address this tendency within the ACNA, which you briefly alluded to on the front end of this episode, to find some kind of common ground and make a vanilla kind of Anglicanism, that's not all that distinctive at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I wanted to be able to highlight with the article too is that this isn't new. This was actually fairly, I would say this was also the majority view of Anglicans at the time of the Revolution. The difference is which Anglican churches survived and created a lasting healthy communities that continued to be faithful to the church and to be sustainable. And the irony is, if you look at a map of the Episcopal Church in the early 1800s, the majority of Anglicans are now in New England. How did that happen? Well, part of that was that in New England they cared about the distinctives of Anglicanism. Then generation after generation, people stuck with the church. Versus even in Virginia, which just before the Revolution, it was the established church. The majority of Virginians would have been members of the Church of England. They were required on penalty of fine to go to Anglican churches every Sunday, right before the Revolution. Well, in the early 1800s, the Church of England has been scoured. Nobody goes to Church of England churches nearly as much anymore. The Episcopal Church in Virginia existed and was fairly large, but not proportionate to the fact that Virginia was the largest state in the Union. Right. So it should have been this massive, disproportionate church. I pointed also to another example where the church did hold on was in South Carolina, where it was, again, another high church area that was very consistent on the distinctives of the prayer book and of the 39 Articles and enforcing those distinctives of Anglicanism. Okay, so today, the same instinct to compromise exists now. The difference in Virginia and Georgia, and that time, Georgia is a great example of this because it was explicitly founded on let's not require a lot of the canons and rules and liturgy to be enforced in Georgia in the hope that it will attract more dissenters to the church. It just didn't work. Now, there might have been big, meetings that lasted a couple years of people that were meeting physically in Church of England churches, but those people they didn't stick around. They weren't in it for the long-term discipleship, which we're actually called to as Christians. They just kind of showed up for this, thing that was happening and then left. A great example of this is when we hear about those, kind of tent revivals that were so common in the Great Awakening. Benjamin Franklin went to tons just to hear people preach. So he was a person in the crowd. But if you know anything about Benjamin Franklin, he wasn't changed. He was a deist barely, he made his own rules for what was actually important. Those things could look on the surface like they're full of people and it's this powerful, booming ministry. But in reality, if you kind of take the bird's eye view and look at what is this actually doing to the church in the long run, the impact is marginal. In the modern ACNA, I think the temptation, and there's a variety of economic incentives for this today, right? So one of the things is the way most churches make money is they have people sitting in the pews and they donate. That wasn't always the case in church history, and it wasn't, especially not in the Church of England, where there were other economic ways of supporting churches. For instance, in Pennsylvania, the proprietary family, so the Penns in Pennsylvania, right? Originally, William Penn was a Quaker. His sons convert to Anglicanism and try to support the church there. So they have this huge fund, and they're not as reliant in Pennsylvania eventually on just getting people to show up and tithe, I guess you could say, as other churches would have been, because they have this resource. But today, that is definitely not the case. We don't have, the equivalent of the owner of one entire state saying, I will support your ministry just because I agree with you. So the temptation is, okay, how can we get people in and tithing and keep this ministry running and growing and all these kinds of things? But the lesson I hope people can learn from just the presentation I make in the article is actually, if we want to have a sustainable church, we have to insist on the distinctives of Anglicanism because they're true, they're right, and the kind of unspoken reality that I think anyone, whether they agree or disagree with us, can recognize is if the distinctives you guys have on paper are negligible, then why have them?
Right. Exactly.
There's no point in there being an Anglicanism at all unless those things matter. And the reason that they're in there, frankly, the reason that our formularies put those distinctives in there is because they thought that they did matter, and they were convicted that they matter. And personally, I'm convicted that they matter, that those distinctives matter, and that we should insist upon them. And when you impress that perspective on somebody, then they can understand why they might want to contribute to the mission that our church is doing, the evangelism and discipleship that the church has to do.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, with that pause, I think we've reached a conclusion. I mean, I don't really have anything else to add. Like, one of the things that's interesting to me about this whole conversation is the fact that, things feel really bleak right now, like religiously and culturally, and yet there's just this constant pull. You can be down in the trenches of, cultural despair, and the one thing that continues to be there are these various customs and inherited, the prayer book, of course, but also just the entire aesthetic and the conversations, the letters, the reflections that the Anglican tradition provides. And that's one of the pulls of a podcast like this, is there's this broad tradition that we can always cling to in the midst of various types of darknesses. And so, of course, this isn't the worst time in history or anything like that. And if you look at the revolutionary period of America, you could say that the Anglican experience in America was on its last legs, and some people may have been of that perspective, but it's not. Of course, these things are always there for us if we can just find the courage to hold them up and hold them into the light and to share. These are treasures that are very attractive to people who may just need to hear about them.
Yeah, a great example of this is, if you think we're in a particularly precarious position today as Anglicans in America, there was a point where bishops were retiring early without successors in the Bishop of New York, Samuel Provoost, who just said, well, I think, the Episcopal Church at the time, it's over. We're done. Nobody's going to church anymore. And he retired to his garden and didn't tell anybody or do anything about it and just let it go, because he thought that the idea of the Episcopal Church was just kind of done. And the obvious reality of that is that did not happen. God did a work to save the Episcopal Church, and that was not like the heat map. Basically, the point I want to make is the heat map of where the Episcopal Church was strong wasn't the same every 100 years. So if you had looked in the 1600s, where is the Church of England the strongest? In the South. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, if you look 100 years later, it's not that anymore. It's New England. Mm-hmm. Right. And then if you look 100 years later, it's changing. There's a large movement of what are called the missionary bishops. And so you get, Philander Chase, Jackson Kemper going west and doing a lot of mission work and they're all high churchmen. Mm-hmm. of various persuasions, and they had a lot of success. There's a couple good quotes from Philander Chase's life in the article, because I think it's so interesting. But he used to go around on horseback as a bishop from town to town, confirming people, and was having a lot of success in Ohio at that time, which was basically he was building the Episcopal Church out there from its bootstraps. One of the demographic realities that the Episcopal Church had to endure during this period of expansion west was the majority of people moving west were migrants either from other countries, so Germans, but even at this point it would have been like Scotch, Presbyterians, all those kind of things, people who weren't familiar with the Church of England. And, are we just going to abandon the frontier to other denominations, or what are we going to do about that? But he basically said, no, we're going to build the church here strong. And it's going to be people that might not know what the prayer book is yet, but we're going to teach them. Mm-hmm. And they're going to learn to love it. And then they did. And he actually had a lot of success doing that. So, and he didn't do that by saying, we're going to kind of have a halfway house between their spirituality and prayer book spirituality. He just gave them the prayer book and insisted upon it.
Yeah. Well, good, Jared. Do you have any other thoughts, or should we close out?
I think it's a good note to close on.
Well, Joe, I appreciate your time, and I hope anybody listening to this goes and reads the article. And I haven't done this before, but we should have like a show notes page where I'll link this so I can throw that up somewhere. But again, thank you for the article, and thank you for your time discussing it. These are fascinating. Yeah.
No, we could just mention it here. So for those who want to see the article, it's called Old High Church Planting. and you can find it at North American Anglican. So that's NorthAM, Anglican.com. Go there, you'll find Old High Church Planting to read the article.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jared. Everyone else, we'll see you in a week, and make sure you like and subscribe us on the various podcast feeds and on YouTube and all of that too. And I'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining us this week on Canterbury Trails. If you like what you hear, we'd appreciate your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing on whatever platform you're hearing us. Stay tuned for more weekly episodes, and we'll see you next time on the Canterbury Trails.